Hey y'all, it's Ryan, and today I wanted to talk to you about a really important study conducted by Jasmin Brooks and colleagues where they examined how perceived discrimination relates to suicide capability. Briefly, they found that perceived discrimination was associated with one's capability for suicide among Black adults but not white adults. This study is particularly strong because of the author's grounding in theory and comparison of the effect across Black and white adults, which Jasmin will talk more about in just a minute. So this is the first of a two-part video series about this paper. And today we're focusing on the results of this important study, and next week you'll hear more about Jasmin's actual process of completing this study, which was also her master's thesis. First, let's hear more about Jasmin and her goals more broadly.
Hi everyone, my name is Jasmin Brooks, and I am a third-year clinical psychology doctoral student at the University of Houston. My passion is to promote the mental health and psychological well-being of Black youth and families. Specifically, I hope to dedicate my career towards conducting research that identifies risk and resilience factors for suicide vulnerability and mental health concerns within Black populations. I hope that ultimately my research will inform the creation of culturally mindful mental health interventions.
If any of Jasmin's goals resonate with you, then give her a follow on Twitter to continue to see her great work. You can also tune in to Jasmin's podcast, We Had the Talk, to hear Jasmin and her sister Kiana have tough conversations that we often shy away from. Their first season focuses on the experience of growing up Black in America and all that comes with it. Okay, now back to the science. Let's hear more about how Jasmin actually began this study.
I am here today to talk to you all about my master's thesis publication entitled Capability for Suicide, Discrimination as a Painful and Provocative Event. So, as I mentioned, part of my research focuses on identifying risk factors for suicide vulnerability within Black populations. However, when I found myself exploring the literature and the most widely cited theoretical framework for suicide, which is the interpersonal theory of suicide, I noticed that literature investigating risk factors that are particularly impactful for Black populations remained extremely limited. Upon further exploration, I realized that several articles had cited that discrimination is associated with a host of negative mental and physical health outcomes for Black individuals, ranging from suicide ideation and depression to hypertension and diabetes. However, no study had yet investigated if there was an association between discrimination and capability for suicide, which is another core component of the interpersonal theory of suicide framework that I will talk to you all about today. So, this became the motivation for my study, specifically examining the association of perceived discrimination and suicide capability and how this differs across Black and white adults.
So what is suicide capability?
Capability for suicide is defined in the model as the physical capability to inflict lethal self-injury. So capability for suicide is thought to occur as a result of repeated exposure to physically painful and psychologically provocative life events, as prolonged exposure to these events is thought to lower the fear and pain of suicidal behavior. The model also highlights that in the presence of suicide thoughts, it is this capability that permits someone to take their own life. So, this brings me back to the purpose of this study, which was to explore the potential association between discrimination and capability for suicide, after accounting for other known risk factors of suicide, including depressive symptoms, suicidal ideation, and non-discriminatory painful and provocative events, such as shooting a gun or imagining killing oneself.
So then we want to know, how does perceived discrimination relate to suicide capability? Let's dive into these findings.
As I mentioned, the sample consisted of Black and white adults. First, to address the potential racial differences that we might see, we conducted a multivariate analysis of variance, or a MANOVA.
And so what is a MANOVA? A MANOVA is a method of analyzing data where you have multiple dependent or outcome variables. So here, those outcome variables were symptoms of depression, suicide ideation, non-discriminatory painful and provocative events experienced, perceived discrimination, and capability for suicide. So Jasmin and her co-authors examined whether Black and white adults experienced different levels of any of these variables.
This analysis revealed that the painful and provocative events scale mean score was significantly higher for white adults than Black adults. But the everyday discrimination scale mean score was significantly higher for Black adults than white adults. So this means that White adults, on average, reported higher levels of non-discriminatory, painful, and provocative events as compared to Black adults in this sample, whereas Black adults reported significantly higher levels of perceived discrimination than white adults in this study. Next, we assessed for correlations between all variables of interest. So, bivariate correlation analyses revealed that for Black and white adults, perceived discrimination was associated with increased symptoms of depression, increased suicidal ideation, and increased non-discriminatory, painful, and provocative events. However, for only Black adults did we see that perceived discrimination was associated with increased capability for suicide. So then lastly, through a stepwise multiple regression analysis, we demonstrated that after accounting for age, gender, depressive symptoms, suicide ideation, and non-discriminatory, painful, and provocative events, perceived discrimination was associated with capability for suicide for Black adults in this sample, but not white adults. This finding to me is just so impactful because it, one, highlights the differences in mental health risk and resilience that can exist across racial groups, and two, it highlights again the extremely powerful impact of perceived discrimination for Black adults. That, in fact, discrimination can be associated with increased suicidal ideation, depressive symptoms, and now the capability to take your own life.
To me, this study is so important because of the clear clinical implications that Jasmin will tell us more about now.
Considering client exposure to discrimination is important when evaluating client distress and formulating a treatment plan and therapy. And so that right there is the story behind my master's thesis, right? Kind of off the record, I realized so much through this project of just how important it is that I dedicate my career to opening our eyes to the impact of discrimination and other unique risk factors for Black communities. And, with that, I hope to continue this research and identify protective factors, right? So we know now that discrimination is associated with capability for suicide. How do we protect Black people, right? That becomes my area of future research.
All right, y'all, that's all for today. Huge thanks to Jasmin for her time and effort on this important study and willingness to join us today. Thanks for stopping by, and be sure to like, subscribe, and share with your friends to support my channel.